that there's a difference between beliefs and values. A lot of times when we deconstruct, we're not really deconstructing our values. We're deconstructing our belief system. And a belief system is more or less how you apply your values. And so the values of kindness and empathy and love that are so important to me, I used to use a Mormonism framework of beliefs to apply those values. Through my deconstruction, I realized those beliefs were no longer serving me, but the values stayed the same. The reconstruction was now figuring out, now how do I apply these values in a way that actually works for me?
Hello and welcome back to Healing and Growing Hand in Hand podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Tickle, and our guest today is Andy Newman. I have been longing for this podcast, and we've tried many times to try to get it going, and we're finally doing it today. And I am excited about what we're going to talk about, and it's because it's been a big thing in my life. But one of the things we're going to talk about for sure is the faith deconstruction to reconstruction.
Yeah.
And I know we could have many podcasts about that alone. And then you had mentioned in a video, and I really like this, and I think this is really important to the listeners, is the 4 major benefits to therapy for faith deconstruction or religious trauma, because we're going to be talking about religious trauma a little bit, is so the 4 of them are self-discovery, processing lingering guilt and shame, healing from trauma, and then building and maintaining healthy relationships. So, Andy, thank you for being here.
Yes, it's a privilege to be here. Thanks for having me. This is my favorite topic. I love talking about it.
You do it a lot too. You do a lot of TikTok videos, and they're so profound, and it's interesting because I know in my life, I started my deconstruction in like 2011. I didn't realize that's what it was. I actually didn't realize there was such a thing until probably about 3 years ago. And
wow.
And I hadn't heard anything about it. I just know I was going through my own thing, and I was really confused for a long time. Now,
Sure.
The one thing it didn't affect was my relationship with God. That it did not affect. What it affected was my relationship to church, to religion, to that whole thing. So, so it was interesting that I figured it out about 3 years ago that's what I was going through, because it was really traumatic. It took me a long time to figure out what it was that I was even trying to do. It was just really confusing. So let's begin with, if you don't mind, can you kind of define religious abuse and trauma?
Yeah, you bet. So we talk a lot in the psychotherapy field now about religious trauma. And generally speaking, we are really just referring to trauma, just any kind of trauma that occurs in a religious setting. And so you can really look at the definition for trauma generally, whether we're just talking about single event trauma or complex trauma. And if that kind of trauma has occurred because of a spiritual leader, because of religious teachings, dogma, community pressure, etc., then it generally falls under the umbrella of religious trauma. When it comes to trauma and the several different types of trauma that you hear discussed, the actual visceral element of trauma, the way that it impacts our body, really doesn't care if it's religion, if it's a car crash, if it's somebody that you love that died. It doesn't care what it is. If it's traumatic, it's traumatic. There's just different subjects or situations that tend to be more likely to cause trauma, and those each come with their own individual implications. Like somebody who maybe has been in the military and has experienced profound trauma, being overseas and seeing combat, etc. We might have a very specific set of interventions or communities, support, et cetera, that we help veterans with because of the type of trauma they've experienced. Similar to we have spiritual trauma or religious trauma that we may need to find specific communities for and have specific interventions for. It also tends to be an interesting difference between those two. High level is a lot of military trauma tends to be your classic PTSD, single event trauma, something specific that happened. Versus religious trauma, we do have single event trauma sometimes with religious trauma, something very specific that happened. And when I refer to single event trauma, I mean something that has a pretty defined beginning and end point. We do have some of that with religious trauma, but usually the religious trauma tends to be complex trauma, which is a
Yeah.
traumatic experience somebody goes through that occurs over a long period of time, a dynamic that they are living in, or a thought process that impacts them heavily, a fear of hell that lingers with them day to day to day, year to year, etc. So that's a high level how I would answer your question on what it is. Does that help?
That helped a lot. That was really,
Cool.
really clear. I appreciate that for our listeners because yeah, there is the regular trauma, the one event trauma, and then there's the complex trauma. And I think a lot of probably what we're going to be talking about would maybe be more along the complex just because things happened over and over and over.
Definitely.
Right? Yeah. So
I would
what
say that's probably the most common experience with religious trauma is the complex PTSD, which is something we're still, as a field in psychotherapy, starting to understand better and better, but we're a little bit behind. Most of our
yeah.
framework for trauma comes from classic 20th century understanding, which really begins with World War I and shell shock and single event trauma. And that's really how we viewed trauma for decades.
Yeah.
And just within the last several decades, we're starting to appreciate the reality of complex trauma and how different the interventions tend to need to be for it.
So true. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's something that I share on my podcast is that, for so many years, I'm 61, so I'm a little older. And I started my healing journey at 19, but for so many years, there
Yeah.
wasn't anything out there. There
Mhm.
wasn't the trauma
Mhm.
therapy. There wasn't the modalities that they have now. And there wasn't even, like you say, the understanding
Right.
of what, about trauma like they do now. And I think that I know that as I've learned more about my trauma, it's really accelerated my healing. So yeah. So on the deconstruction and reconstruction of religion really is what it was for me. What is that exactly? Explain to our listeners so that they understand where we're going with this.
So I like that you're asking that question right after we just talked about religious trauma, because I think that right out the gate, that's a differentiation I'd like to make, that religious deconstruction does not equal religious trauma, and religious trauma does not equal religious deconstruction. They're two completely different subjects that
True.
sometimes go hand in hand. A lot of people who are deconstructing their faith have also experienced some degree of religious trauma, but not everyone who deconstructs has experienced religious trauma. And also, not everyone who has experienced religious trauma will end up deconstructing their faith. There are plenty of people that I have worked with that are going through and processing and experiencing profound religious trauma, but it has not impacted their belief system at all. And they don't want it to. They want
Right.
to be able to process and have space to deal with that trauma and retain their faith. And so I think it's important to carve out
Mm-hmm.
the difference between the two. I already explained religious trauma, and the faith deconstruction is the process by which this is not a dictionary definition. There's probably a much more eloquent definition of this. So I'm just going to make this up right now. So everyone go fact check me on what the better definition is. But generally speaking, it's when somebody realizes that the set of beliefs they have been raised with, or they have adopted at some point in their life, don't add up, and they start to really critically think through their belief system and deconstruct it down to, what do I actually believe, and what do I reject. And so it can be a very painful process
Mm-hmm.
of sifting through really your whole worldview.
Yes.
In some cases, that's definitely what it was for me. And that kind of leaves you in a place, once you've stripped it all down, where you're left with a dilemma of now reconstructing and picking the pieces back up to
Mm-hmm.
just to figure out, what do I believe. I find it worth noting in the context of this conversation as well, Lisa, that there's a difference between beliefs and values. A lot of times when we deconstruct, we're not really deconstructing our values, we're deconstructing our belief
Mm-hmm.
system. And a belief system is more or less how you apply your values. And so
Okay.
the values of kindness and empathy and love that are so important to me, I used to use a Mormonism framework of beliefs to
Right.
apply those values. Through my deconstruction, I realized those beliefs were no longer serving me, but the values stayed the same.
Mm-hmm.
The reconstruction was now figuring out, now how do I apply these values in a way that actually works for me?
Oh, that's such a great way to explain it. I wish we would have talked in 2011. Seriously, this would have
I
helped
wouldn't
me.
have known this then, but yeah. I need a time machine.
Seriously, because I mean, that's exactly what it is. Because, as I was saying before, is that my my values have not changed. The
Yeah.
core of who I am really is the same. I still love people. I want to help people, and all that is the same. You're right. I just had to find a different way to apply it. That's
I think that's
crazy.
the case for most people. And one of the fears that I see people approaching as they face deconstruction is they kind of assume that they're just going to be a completely different person, that their values are, going to be tossed to the wayside. And sometimes we see minor shifts in value systems,
Sure.
but usually not. Usually not.
And wouldn't you say that one of the motivating factors in all this is fear? Like there's so much fear. Do you think I
Um,
because I'll
Tell me what you mean. I think I can I imagine how fear applies for most people, but
for
be more
me,
specific.
so I'll explain where this question's coming from. For me,
Yeah.
as I was beginning to deconstruct, again,
Mm,
it didn't change my belief in God. It made me
sure.
question the Bible and how it was presented.
Hmm.
But then there was just so much fear. And I think that's why I kept my mouth shut about it for so long, is there was just so much fear that what if I'm wrong? What if I'm right? Just there was just a lot of confusion. So it created a lot of fear, and it even stirred up a lot of um, I don't know, just a lot of questions. And I've been a Christian, if you want to say, as far back as I can remember. It is the
Sure.
essence of who I have been. Um, but there was just
Great.
so much fear that maybe I'd make God mad, or
Mm.
just my whole belief system. It's really scary to all of a sudden have this belief system that you've had for so many years. Even though I will say there were things along, and this is what made me question it. There were things along the way where I really kind of questioned. I was like, ooh, that doesn't sit well with me, but I kept my mouth shut
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah.
But even when I got to that point where I decided, okay, I need to take a step back and I need to figure this out, there was so much fear. And I
Yeah.
think a lot of that was probably confusion and
Sure.
just not understanding what I was going through, one,
Yeah.
and two, what it meant and how like you say, how I'm going to come out of this the other side. And I had nobody helping me.
Yeah. Yeah. I like where you're coming from on that. And I do appreciate a discussion on fear because it's very relevant to most people's journeys through deconstruction. And I think where I see it being the most relevant is maybe on two angles. On the onset of a deconstruction, there's a profound amount of fear for most people surrounding what the implications of
Yeah.
allowing themselves to even think this way could be. I often hear people who are very afraid of losing their support group,
Yeah.
a support network. I myself was terrified I would lose my family.
Hmm.
People are, a lot of that is characterized by fear. And then after the fact, there can be lingering fears for some time that you're wrong. What if I'm wrong? And what if I'm going to hell, etc. And so first of all, I want to normalize that idea that if there's a lot of fear in your journey, you're in good company. That's a very, very common experience. And I also think it's worth stepping outside of deconstruction for a minute. And if we want to view this from a God perspective, um, think about a parent. Okay, why do you want to have a relationship with your mom or your dad ideally, or even just picture a good, what you would view as a good parent, right? Is it fear that motivates you to have a relationship with them? And if it is that a healthy relationship?
Yeah.
And so I think it's worth examining the motives for keeping you in a religion. And if you are motivated to retain a belief in God or retain participation in your religion because you experience genuine religious fulfillment from being there,
Yeah.
you enjoy the community, it enriches your life, etc., then that's probably a healthy way to interact with religion. But if you are just terrified that you're going to go to hell if you don't keep doing this, that's not a healthy setup. I don't care what anybody tells you. That doesn't sound like a loving parent to me that would just want to scare the crap out of me
Yeah.
into staying with them. And so I also think it's worth exploring with people. All right, where is that fear coming from exactly? Right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
kind of take it from there. But yeah, that fear is very, very very consistent.
Hey, thank you for listening so far. If you're enjoying this podcast, be sure to subscribe so you won't ever miss an episode. Yeah, there was, you touched on something I didn't even realize it, and it was one of my fears too. Is what are all these people going to think?
Oh yeah.
All these people in my life,
Yeah.
and it was, yeah, I was going to lose my support system that I had.
Right.
Um, one of the things that I had written down here that I thought we could touch on in all of this, when it comes to this, is the never belonging and trying to fit in.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I won't say who this person is on this podcast yet, but I have someone in my life who is right now literally going through this.
Mhm.
And the one thing this person said, and once they said it, I was like, wow, that fits right, is unless you're kind of an extrovert, it's kind of you have a hard time in church and you have a hard time fitting in. And this person in my life is an introvert and is not comfortable in a social setting. And that created that's kind of what started their deconstructing, was that particular situation, and started kind of questioning a lot of stuff in the Bible. But do you find that is a common feeling that people have, or what what this person's experiencing, right? Of saying, I see a lot of extroverts that are standing out in front of the church waving everybody in, and they're going to be your best friend, and then once you get into the
Yeah.
church it changes.
Yeah, and I can only speak to my experience with Mormonism. It's absolutely a religion,
Yeah.
I think, that was made for extroverts, and extroverts tend to thrive the most in it. And in general, just the idea of fitting in versus belonging. I love Brene Brown's framework for this. Fitting in is scanning a room and making sure that you are meeting the expectations of the room. Belonging is being who you are and being accepted for who you are. And I
Ooh.
think this is one example of how a religion like Mormonism, and from my experience, other high control religions sound very much in line with this. I'm just
Yeah.
being clear that I don't have experience with them directly.
Hmm.
But if you are an introvert, it can be a very uncomfortable experience, especially with something like a 2-year mission. I actually experienced this firsthand. I was lucky in the sense that I am very extroverted, and so I was able to assimilate very well into mission life, and there's a number of reasons for that as well. But I was a leader in the mission and was kind of charged with going after the wayward missionaries who were struggling, right?
Mm.
And there was one missionary in particular I remember taking out, and the whole thing that we were working on was he was just so scared of talking to random people.
Yeah.
And at the time, I really regret the way that I approached that, because I definitely treated him like this is a problem you've got to get over. And now what I see is a very genuine, salt of the earth kind of guy who just is an introvert. And so going on the street and talking to random people about Jesus was something he was deeply uncomfortable with and remained uncomfortable for his whole mission. And I really wish that I would have just been able to hold more space for that and say, hey, man, this is really uncomfortable. It's okay. Let's go get a burger instead, you know?
Yeah.
But of course, there wasn't room for that on the mission experience.
Yeah.
And I think that people experience that kind of thing in a lot of different ways, not just introvert versus extrovert. You have women perhaps who are more extroverted, actually,
Hmm.
women who are more strong willed, have strong opinions they'd like to share. And this is a system that doesn't want women's voices to be heard very consistently. They want women to be more kind of submissive and meek, and the keep sweet kind of mentality that we
Oh,
got from the FLDS church. They
yes.
don't say it like that in Mormonism, but they definitely kind of push that. And I think some of those norms are changing a little bit depending on where you live and what your ward is like. But that's another example of how who you are could be really demonized. And I mean, for me, I was definitely a free spirit. I didn't have a lot of respect for rules, and that got beat out of me. And that's
Ooh.
a big reason why my mission was a good experience, was I was so afraid of authority that I was obsessively obedient. And that was how I changed who I was as a
Mm.
person to fit in with the group and survive.
Oh my goodness. Oh, that's awful. Yeah. Yeah. And I don't think I said this before the recording started, but I know that for me, I enjoyed church. I love worship. There was a lot of things that I loved about it.
Sure.
Um, but there were times where things didn't sit well with me.
Yeah.
There would be a
Mm.
situation and I would question it and I would be told to basically be quiet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Be quiet. Yeah. And I've seen situations in churches where the husband has been told that he needs to quiet down his little wife. I'm not kidding. I've seen this, and it was those things that finally made me take a step back, and it didn't sit well with me,
Yeah.
and I didn't understand why. And so anyway, it's been a long road. And once I realized though that I was going through deconstruction and I was understanding what it was going on, it became so much easier to kind of work through it and figure it out. Because like I said, I went for like 10 years of not knowing what the hell was going on with
What's
me.
going on?
Yeah, what's going on
And
with
it
me?
makes sense to me that that started to make more sense to you because where you're at in a high control religion in that sense is you're really being told to doubt yourself
Yeah.
and trust the institution. And so when you have those kinds of questions and you get that kind of feedback, it's a way of saying, hey, that gut feel you've got, your self talking to you that something doesn't feel right, you're actually wrong. Don't trust that. Don't listen
Hmm.
to that. And that can be very disorienting when you get messaging like that over a long period of time. And when you're able to crack out of it and start to trust yourself more, that's where deconstruction can really start picking up pace. Because I mean, where I see a lot of the mental blocks built up with people that makes it very difficult for them to deconstruct is there's so much mental conditioning against trusting yourself that it's so easy, natural for most people who deconstruct high control religions to spend the first several years of deconstruction not even realizing that they're deconstructing, but
Hmm.
really what they're doing is they're just fighting with themselves and trying to deny what they're actually thinking,
That is
because there's
exactly.
so much deep-seated distrust with self because of the way that they've been brought up.
You know what? That's crazy. That's exactly what happened. And I'll tell you, because I have always trusted my intuition, and I've got a really strong intuition. It's getting stronger now, but I always had a
Good.
strong intuition,
Yeah.
and it
I'm sure the church hated that
oh, they totally
about
hated
you.
that. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And what you're saying is exactly what happened, because right at the time that I started the deconstruction, there were things that happened that all of a sudden I absolutely couldn't trust myself. And it was the first time in my
Yeah.
life that, because that's the only person besides God that I could really trust all those years. And all of a sudden I
Sure.
couldn't even trust myself anymore. And it was completely derailing for me. I didn't understand what
Yeah.
was going on. And it was messages I knew it was right. And I started to question it. And it spun me out for a few years where I didn't know what to do with myself, because I felt like, well, I can't trust myself now. I have to question everything and it took a long time for me to finally figure that out.
Yeah.
And and it's like, now that I do know where I stand, my intuition has gotten stronger, and I listen to it a lot more, because when I don't listen to it, I get in trouble every single time.
I see, and this extends beyond faith deconstruction. Just as the work that I've done clinically, I see people reach much more positive outcomes in their life when they place trust in themselves than when they don't. And
Yeah.
generally speaking, where I see the most problems that people face and the most, um, I guess, difficult situations people end up in, mistakes, etc., usually is coming from a place of acting when they did not trust themselves
Yep.
and they decided to trust either an institution or somebody else over themselves. Your gut that you have, everyone listening to this, I just want you to hear from me, whatever my opinion's worth to you, your gut is more valuable than you realize.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, how would someone work through that? I'm not sure how I did it, but when you trust yourself and then you have something like this happen to you where you can't even trust yourself, what would be steps that a person could take?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's something that I find myself really working with people on over time.
Yeah.
I don't want to overly suggest therapy because obviously I'm going to be biased in that sense. I am a therapist.
I
I
support
believe
it
in what
though.
I do.
100%.
I see a therapist myself, but I
Yeah.
do think having somebody who is an unbiased third party really helps in
Yeah.
establishing trust. And then also I would urge patience on this.
Yeah.
Building trust in any context takes time. We see that in relationship therapy. We see that in so many different contexts. And so allow yourself time to build that trust. but then also allow yourself to critically think through it. A lot of the
Hmm.
benefit of deconstruction is really starting to allow yourself to critically think through so many things. Let self trust be one of those things. Look at the evidence in your life.
Ah,
When have you trusted yourself before, and what was the outcome? Almost every time I do that kind of activity with people, people are able to see, oh, yeah, that actually
yeah.
worked out really well, or this worked really well, or I figured that out. And then when haven't you trusted yourself? What are some examples of when you really felt something you said, no, I'm going to set that aside? I'll give you an example. My whole life, I felt this calling to be an ally of the LGBTQ community. I had friends
Oh,
who were queer growing up. I was a theater kid, and so I got a nice little potent dose in Iowa. And they were my favorite people.
I
I
know.
loved my gay friends
Me
and my
too.
trans friends. I had such an affinity for them, and it felt to me that I needed to be somebody who was advocating for them, not because
Hmm.
I think I think a lot of people need to feel this way, but that's just, I felt like that was important for me.
Hmm.
But I felt like because of the messaging I was getting from the church that I was wrong,
Yeah.
that was wrong for me to do, and I
Yes.
needed to set that aside. And I spent so many years demonizing myself for feeling that affinity, thinking there's something wrong with me. I must not trust God enough, because I want to do this. No, I was right
Yeah.
all along.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I struggled with that too because I was told, you can't even hang out with them because, you might be.
Yeah,
I'm like, oh, really? That's
it's
just,
contagious.
oh, yeah, it's going to spread. It was ridiculous. It
Hey,
was.
I'd be okay with that. I mean, I think gay people are cool. If they pass that on to me, that'd be fine. But
I'm
still
telling
didn't
you,
happen.
they're wonderful people. And I think,
Yeah,
I think in my life now, gosh, if I didn't have them in my life, just how empty it would be. I've got wonderful people like
yeah,
that in my life. So,
yeah,
you mentioned about therapy, and I will 100% support it. And I always tell people the first thing you should do is go to trauma therapy, 100%. You need to have that support system and its specialized treatment that you need. So I will always say, go to therapy, and I go to therapy
yeah,
too. So with that said, the other thing that we wanted to talk about, or I wanted to talk about, was the four major benefits to therapy for faith deconstruction and or
yeah.
religious trauma. So the first one you mentioned is self-discovery.
I think we pretty much hit on that just now.
Yeah.
I would say the self discovery ties very strongly to the trust, but also allowing yourself a little bit of space to realize things that maybe you really enjoy that the church may have muted in a sense.
Oh,
I
yes.
see this a lot with
Yes.
women, especially.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of women, there's a lot of like career options that they
Uh-huh.
want to explore that have been demonized, or hobbies, or tarot cards, or whatever it is that just they've actually always really, or smut,
Yoga.
right? That's a
Yoga.
great example. Yeah, yeah, maybe yoga. So I think that allowing yourself space to explore. I know I've seen this a lot with my own life, allowing myself space to explore coffee for the first time.
Mm.
And how, like, now I'm kind of a coffee snob. I've got a very specific blend that I like, and I'm really happy about the coffee that I drink. And so, those are things that I've always wanted to do, but I just felt like I shouldn't do. And so I encourage, for the self-discovery piece, I'll invite people to just think, what is that thing that you always wanted to do, but you just felt like you shouldn't? And
Oh,
how do you feel about it now? Do you still feel like you shouldn't, or is it something that maybe with this new framework, maybe there's space for it now,
right.
and maybe we should start leaning into that and just try it on for size? Sometimes it resonates, and sometimes another good example of this is alcohol for me. Couldn't drink, right? And I did drink a little bit in high school, so I kind of knew what it was about. But as I've made space for it as an ex-Mormon, I've realized, I don't mind drinking here and there with friends, but I don't really like alcohol.
Yeah.
And so it's not something that I'm really doing very much. I thought I would do it so much more. And so actually, when it was restricted, I was more interested in it, to now where it's wide open. I'm like, I'll have a beer. Like, I had a beer with my sister the other night, but that's about it.
That's so funny. I was going to say, when you weren't allowed to have it, you were probably very interested in it.
So much more. Yeah. Yeah. This is the forbidden fruit was
Yes.
intoxicating, literally.
That's so true. And then, okay, so the next one is processing. Oh, yeah. Processing lingering guilt and shame. And that one,
Yeah.
that's a big one.
How did that impact you?
The guilt. The guilt
Yeah.
was really hard. I mean, I felt really guilty towards God for a long time. Like, I felt like I was hurting him. That was the first
Mm,
thing. It took me a while to realize that that's what I felt But there was
Yeah.
a lot of guilt. And then I felt guilty about my son because I raised him in church and now I'm not going to church. And so
Oh, I hear that a lot.
what
Yeah.
kind of mom am I? He even said to me one time, "You changed, mom." And the
Mm,
way he said it, the look on his face, guys, it might make me cry. It really, it was like, ooh, like he wasn't mad, but he was disappointed, kind of,
mm.
you know? And so that one tore my heart out.
Yeah, that's tough.
Yeah.
That's really tough. The way that it impacts relationships can be really difficult, and is an opportunity for us to do a lot of differentiation work and learning to let people feel the way they do about it. And
Right.
that's not because we have deliberately harmed them. Sometimes something's just sad. I think a really good example of this is when somebody maybe is LGBTQ and they come out to a loved one. There can be an understandable amount of grief there that
Yes.
is not non-affirming. It's just an adjustment of expectations. Maybe I always assumed that you would get married to a woman and that we would have grandkids that were biological. And now that shifted a little bit, and that's going to take me a little bit to process. But that doesn't
Yeah.
mean I don't love and support you. Sometimes it does mean that, and that's another can of worms. But yeah, I think that letting people feel the way they do, I think is important. But
Well,
the guilt and shame is huge. Sorry, go on, and then I'll talk about guilt and shame.
I was just going to say, part of my guilt too is I actually had people within the church turn on me, full on turn on me, and actually tell me they
Yeah.
can't be my friend. These are people
See, and
that
that
the day before they were telling me how
yeah,
much they love me, and then the next
yeah,
day,
yeah.
yeah,
Is that your fault?
no,
Yeah. No, it's not.
it's their
It's
response to my action,
yeah, and that's a tricky thing to sit with because it's a result of something you've done, right?
a
But
decision.
it's also a very very disappointing reaction on their part that's, in my opinion, completely unnecessary. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's sad when that kind of thing happens, and I think it's also coming out, and part of the deconstruction for a lot of people is realizing you're not the main character, as the kids say, meaning not everything is your fault in this
Oh
context.
yeah.
When people reject you or people say judgmental things, that doesn't mean that you've done anything wrong. That may be more of a reflection of where they are at, and
Bingo.
that's a hard thing to internalize because of again, the conditioning puts people in a place where it's the automatic assumption when somebody is upset with you or disappointed with you immediately goes to, I have done something wrong.
Right. Exactly. That's so true. Yeah, and I've said this before, but we're responsible for our actions and our reactions, but we're not responsible for their actions or their reactions.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And then you said the third one is healing from trauma, which we've been kind of talking about. I didn't know if you wanted to touch on that some more.
Yeah, I just think it's really valuable work. And if you think that you may have experienced religious trauma, I would highly recommend meeting with a therapist who is trauma informed
Mm-hmm.
and trained. In there's a number of modalities that I am a big fan of. I love narrative exposure therapy. I love EMDR, of course.
Mm-hmm. I've done that
I
one.
love internal family systems
Mhm.
therapy as well. There's a number of others, a lot of great trauma interventions that can happen. But I also would not assume that just because you're leaving a high control religion that you've definitely experienced religious trauma. Get an assessment. Have it explored. Just because it's hard doesn't mean it's been traumatic.
Right.
Trauma is a very subjective experience. That said, and I mean, depending on the religion, there is a good chance that you've experienced religious trauma, but it's worth vetting that out first before you jump into intensive trauma work.
Right. Right. Yeah. Good point. Good point. And then, excuse me, the fourth one is building and maintaining healthy relationships. That's a tough
Yeah.
one. That's a tough one because for me, it was tough for me to get back into relationships because that hurt. That really hurt when I got
Mm.
rejected. I understood what their position was, but it was really painful and it was challenging until I worked through it in my head to rebuild or to build new relationships.
Yeah, it can. And there's a really good framework from a book I read called The Science of Stuck. I'm forgetting the author's name. I think it was
Mm,
Britt something. Not a book about deconstruction, but she has
yeah.
a whole chapter on adult friendships that I think is really
Ooh.
helpful for people who are deconstructing to to read, but something that she talks a lot about is understanding the role that your friend in your life or this relationship plays in your life. And something
Mm.
that is really unfortunate when you leave a high control religion is tend to be at least a couple people in your life that can no longer be really deep emotional confidants for you, at least on the subject of what you're going through for faith deconstruction. Um, this is something that I really detest high control religions for, but it just is what it is. They tend to make it very difficult for people to hear any criticism or negative experience with the religion without that person then internalizing as an insult. And so if I talk to somebody who's a very active, devout Mormon about my religious trauma, for example, I might not be even criticizing their church on the surface, but them hearing how negative my experience
Mm-hmm.
was with the church could very naturally make them defensive. And so it's not really a safe setup for me to be able to have a connecting conversation with them, right? And so the role that an active believing member of the church can play in my life now might shift. Not always. Some members are nuanced enough that they can hold space for it, and that's great.
Mm.
But a lot of times what you've got to start learning how to differentiate is, okay, what can this person be in my life right now? I'll give you a great example. One of my best friends, and I mean this, one of my best real life friends is the sitting bishop of the ward that my wife and kids still go to. He is a Mormon bishop today, and we run together on a very regular basis. We train together all the time. We talk about running. We talk about sports. We're both big sports fans. We pay attention to football and basketball and a bunch of other sports. And we are constantly talking about these things. Now, while he understands my spiritual journey on some level and understands where I'm at and that I've left the church, etc., it's not really a topic that we connect over, right? Because we
Right.
just respect that we're in totally different places. We're probably not going to connect over that.
Right.
But does that mean that our friendship, that our relationship is worthless now?
Mm.
No. We still connect very well in the zones that we connect. And so the role that he plays in my life is not a spiritual leader, is not somebody who I can share my religious trauma with. He's somebody I can go have fun and run with and talk about running gear and the new shoes I bought and the new PR that I got on my half marathon or whatever it is. And that's a role that he plays very well and that I play for him very well. And we respect that that's the zone that our friendship is in. And so I would just encourage, for building and maintaining healthy relationships, especially on maintaining, understand that the role that somebody in your life can play might shift when you leave the
Yeah.
church. And that's okay. That's okay. Just learn what that role is.
Oh, that's so interesting. I love that. And that's, that's also two very mature men coming together and doing that, because that takes a lot of maturity to be able to do that,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
That's
I mean, I
beautiful.
wasn't great at it at first, I'll be honest. I stopped talking to him for like a year, but I came back. I was like, I'm sorry. We could probably still run together, right? He's like, yeah.
Can we still be friends? Oh
he
my
was he
gosh.
was real cool about it. He's like, I figured you just needed space. Like, guys, he's been really great. And that's actually a
Oh,
big thing that has made that friendship work for me is I do feel like, and I think this is necessary, he respects the space that I need, the boundaries that I need. He's not trying to push me to come back to church. He's not judging me as far as I can pick up on. And so he's been very respectful of my journey, even if it's something we don't need to connect over.
right. Oh my God, that's beautiful. I love hearing that. Yeah, it's interesting because the person I was talking about earlier that's going through their deconstruction, they
Hmm.
actually they what they started to do was go to some different churches just to see, just curiosity. And
Sure.
Mormon was the first one. He was curious because this person had
Don't do it. No, I'm just kidding. It
you
works
know
for a
what
lot of people.
he read the Book of Mormon so he could walk in there intelligently, and it was interesting because he ended up getting a friend out of it, and it was the same kind of thing. Some of the other people were coming up and kind of not harassing him but putting pressure on him, and this one
Oh,
particular
yeah.
gentleman was not, and now like they'll go have lunch together, and it's the same thing, and I said it's a beautiful thing. You can have a friendship, and you're not the same religion, but it's okay.
It should be just like that. Yeah. For a lot of things.
Yeah, yeah, I know, right? For a lot of things. It's so true. Well, this has been really interesting. And excuse me, and before we close up, why don't you tell us what you would like to leave our listeners with?
Oh wow. So many things I could say. I think if there's one thing I would love to gift, maybe I'll just say this, and something that I would encourage everyone to work towards. But if I could gift every person I've ever worked with through deconstruction, I would gift them self-love.
Oh, so
I
true.
so much of what I see people go through puts people in a place where they just really are uncomfortable with who they are, or
Yeah.
they don't love them, or they even hate themselves
Yes.
sometimes, or have a lot of tension with themselves. And I'm here to tell you, I haven't met anybody who doesn't deserve to love themselves and experience what that is like. And so, if I could leave your listeners with anything, that would be it. Like, please, if you don't love yourself, find a way to talk to
Hmm.
people about, like, find ways to work towards that, because life is too short to spend it hating the person you spend the most time with.
Amen to that. So true. So true. And if our listeners want to reach out to you, of course, we'll have it all in the show notes and everything. But why don't you tell the listeners how they could reach out to you?
Well, to book an appointment, just Andy Newman Therapy. All the traditional spelling you can think about, no weird Newman like German stuff. We changed that like 200 years ago. So ANDYNEWMAN therapy at gmail.com. Or you can just find me on social media if you want to hang out and
TikTok.
interact with my content too. I'm on TikTok and Instagram now.
Yeah. 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 TikTok, you've got some great videos. I mean, I could probably have you on here every week and we'd have a whole nother subject to talk about. I'm not kidding. They're so great. But thank you so much for
Appreciate
being
that.
here. And thank you you gave a lot of clarity for me and I know for the listeners as well. So thank you so much for that.
You bet. Yeah, this was fun. Thanks for having me, Lisa.
Mhm.